Hi everyone, a very warm welcome to our third seminar in the Rylands Lunchtime seminar series. My name is Guida Armstrong from the Italian department of the John Rylands Research Institute, and I'll be chairing the session today. You're joining us live from the map room at the University of Manchester and various offices within and beyond the university. Returning viewers by now will know that this is we're experimenting with a new format for these seminars. It's a remote presentation format which allows participants to view collection objects and also interact with the researchers as a discussion. So our seminar today is on maps and magic in the Manchester Geographical Society collections, and it's going to be presented by Brian Wallace and Donna Sherman. But before I introduce our speakers, I'd just like to do some housekeeping notices. So first of all, this event is being recorded and it will be edited and made available on the John Rylands Library YouTube channel. Audio subtitles are available now using your own settings. We're using a Zoom webinar format as well, so that means that your camera and mic is disabled on entry. At the end of the session, there should be about 15 minutes for questions. So if you'd like to ask a question, could you type it into the Q&A box, which you should see in your Zoom window. These will then be selected by me as the chair and relayed to the panel. We should have time to take quite a few questions, I hope. We're aiming to finish the seminar around 12:45. As we go through as well, you can also use the general chat function for comments and questions if you don't put them in the question box. We'll be monitoring both of these channels throughout the seminar. And finally, as I said at the start, this is quite a new format for us, so we'll be really interested to learn what you think, and we'll be sending a feedback questionnaire to all participants afterwards. So without further preamble, I'd like to introduce you to our two speakers today. Dr. Brian Wallace works on technology and magic in 19th century imperial encounters. In 2018-19, he was an early career visiting fellow at the John Rylands Research Institute, and now he's a Leverhulme early career fellow with us, working on his project, God from Machines, Technology and Magic in 19th century imperial encounters. Presenting with Brian is Donna Sherman, who's curator of map collections and printed atlases at the John Rylands Research Institute and Library, and she's the special collections subject lead for architecture, geography and planning. She's worked with the library's map collections for almost 15 years now, and she's a member of several societies, including the Manchester Geographical Society and the British Cartographic Society. So thank you both for talking to us today, and over to you both, Brian and Donna.
Thanks, Guida. So maps, like many of our special collections, reveal attitudes, behaviours and values of the past. They tell us about the society in which they were produced and how the past has shaped the present. The collections of the Manchester Geographical Society include books, atlases, maps and lantern slides. The library also holds the Society's archives. Together, the collections offer a captivating insight into Victorian enterprise, exploration, trade, industry and technological innovation. But they also bear witness to imperialism, colonisation, the expansion of empire, and the control and exploitation of natural resources. The Society was formed in 1884 and was one of the most important geographical societies of its day. It was defined by its impressive lecture series, which attracted high-profile explorers such as Captain Scott and Ernest Shackleton. The Society also published its own journal and played a significant part in promoting the teaching of geography in schools and universities in the UK. The motivation for establishing such societies was commercial expansion and seeking new markets and alternative sources of raw materials. This was of particular importance for Manchester due to its thriving industrial growth. The city had also suffered greatly from the lack of raw cotton imported during the American Civil War. The discovery of new and commercially rich areas of Africa brought a wealth of opportunity. But if Britain was to compete effectively with other European countries over Africa's resources, good geographical knowledge would be essential. On this map, you can see the most popular resources exported from West Africa at the end of the 19th century. I'm just going to zoom in here for you a little. For Britain, one of the most important products was palm oil, which was used to produce soap and for lubricants for machinery. The Manchester Geographical Society was launched in 1884, led by a group of prominent Mancunians and businessmen. Its inauguration was timed to coincide with a visit by charismatic explorer Henry Morton Stanley. During this period, Stanley was at the peak of his fame, and his inspiring speech spoke of how geographical knowledge clears the way for commercial enterprise and the beginnings of civilization. His lecture, Central Africa and the Congo Basin, the importance of the scientific study of geography, also contained a passionate appeal for the establishment of local geographical societies. The audience's reaction to Stanley's speech reached fever pitch, and the event received very favourable reviews in the local press. Today, Stanley's legacy is a controversial one and has been met with much deserved criticism. But at the time, he was celebrated as a national hero, and the public appetite for news about his expeditions are evident in the following two maps. The first map displays Stanley's various expeditions throughout Africa. It is a folded map which was produced relatively cheaply for mass consumption. On the reverse, we have a portrait of Stanley. Turn this over for you. There we go. Just take a moment to focus, bear with me. There's also a resume of the great explorer's travels and discoveries. Africa, though, is referred to as the Dark Continent, implying a sense of the unknown and referring to previously unexplored regions. But it may also reveal Western attitudes towards African indigenous people, possibly implying that inhabitants are uncivilized, savage, and without religious or moral beliefs. I'm just going to get the next map now. Looks like an advertisement for a barber's shop. This next map is a supplement from a special issue of the Graphic newspaper. Again, the map celebrates Stanley's various expeditions and documents his role in the Emin Pasha relief expedition. Underneath, a statement explains that due to public demand, the original special issue was out of print in 2 days. And so this and further reprints would be available as special supplements in the Graphic's daily paper. The declared aim of the new society was to promote the study of all branches of geographical science, especially in relation to commerce and civilization. The patrons of the new society represented business, education, and missionary interests, and included manufacturers, merchants, members of parliament, academics, and the clergy. The Chancellor of the Victoria of Manchester held a senior position, as did the Bishop of Salford, later Cardinal Vaughan. Other names you may be familiar with include the editor of the Manchester Guardian, C.P. Scott, and curator of Manchester Museum, Professor Boyd Dawkins. The society also stated that they would allow women to join the society on the same footing as men, and several ladies were elected as members of the committee. Amongst them, the suffragist Lydia Ernestine Becker. A recent blog celebrating Women's Day by Alessia Benedetti reveals some more details, and there should be a link in the chat. Enriqueta Rylands was also an important and highly valued member of the Society. The University of Manchester has had strong connections with the Manchester Geographical Society right from the start. The Society campaigned relentlessly for the subject to receive proper recognition by the universities in Britain, and also contributed to the appointment of the first geography lecturer at Owens College in 1891 and the first professor of geography at Manchester University in 1930. The Society continues to operate today and remains actively involved in the promotion of geography in the northwest of England. Its aims are much less colonial in nature, but the passion for disseminating geographical knowledge continues to persevere. The Society operates on a much smaller scale, but still publishes its own journal and is planning a new lecture series for the autumn. But what of the collections? How did they make their way into the library, and what do we have? So one of the Society's aims was to promote the study of geographical science by forming a collection of maps, charts, geographical works of reference, and specimens of raw materials and commercial products. Throughout its history, the Society developed its library of books, atlases, maps, and lantern slides, as well as developing its own museum of commercial geography. The size of the library was one of the reasons the Society's headquarters relocated to new premises in 1905, which boasted a library, a lecture theatre which could hold over 200 people, and also a map room. However, in 1970, the decision was made to transfer the Society's library to the University of Manchester. The storage at the Society's premises were no longer adequate, and sadly, plans were being made to sell the building. During the late 1990s, several thousand books and atlases from the Society's collection were listed and, in a printed catalogue. The archives were catalogued in 2014. We are currently cataloguing the maps with the help from funding from the Society. We have well over 2,000 of these to keep us busy. The lantern slides offer a more significant challenge. There are approximately 10,000 of these, and they are not yet catalogued. The collections concentrate on 19th and early 20th century exploration, travel, and geography in Africa and Asia, with significant representation of other continents. The geography of Britain and the northwest of England also feature prominently. The nature of the collection clearly illustrates the interests and motivations of the Society. Together, the books, atlases, maps, lantern slides, and archives reflect the spirit of late Victorian imperialist enterprise, and they are an incredibly rich and varied source of research material. I will now hand you over to Brian, who will tell you about some of the items from the Society's collections which relate to his research. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna. So as Donna has said, the souvenir maps collected by the Manchester Geographical Society, along with the popular lecture series that accompanied them, are really an expression of the public interest in African exploration and the mapping of Africa in this period. But the MGS's emphasis on commerce and industry also reflected a growing understanding that it was technological advances and new inventions which were allowing imperial agents to reach further into the unexplored parts of Africa. Steamships, medicines like quinine to fight malaria, new weapons were all among the new tools of empire available. Maps are a really potent illustration of these processes in the period in which filling in the so-called blank spaces of Africa was a driving force. Scientific mapping and understanding became a popular phenomenon as things like the Stanley lecture series would suggest. But they were also, as Donna has said, key to control and exploitation. In his opening address to the MGS, Stanley contrasted it to the Royal Geographical Society in London, with its countless maps from every corner of the world filed away for reference. This was a contrast to what he said a Manchester Geographical Society might be, a more practical, commercially minded organization, with maps drawn up to be used by far-sighted entrepreneurs who could grasp the possibilities of new technologies. So in this heady atmosphere of techno-optimism, it's perhaps unsurprising that the rhetoric of technology as having these magical effects often took on literal connotations when it came to colonial encounters. My project looks at these narratives of technology being reportedly mistaken for magic or deliberately misrepresented as magic in imperial encounters across the long 19th century, from the Pacific explorations of Captain James Cook to the techno-magical narratives which grew up around the administrative technologies of colonial states. So in its first stage, I look at the popularity of techno-magical narratives as they emerged from missionary and imperial agents active in Africa from around the mid-Victorian period. The process of mapping these unknown spaces was an avowedly scientific, rational endeavor, as Stanley expressed it. But modern science and technology often made their first appearances in these spaces surrounded by mystification, superstition, and self-aggrandizement. In his book, Machines as the Measure of Men, Michael Adas opens with an episode of the surveyor William Smith on the African coast in 1740, deploying a theodolite and an odometer which he was wheeling up and down the beach. Smith was confronted by armed locals who he said believed he was bewitching the area with these strange devices. However, he reported that he had managed to drive them off by wheeling the odometer at them and taking advantage of their uncertainty over what this strange device was. Now, I think episodes like this can show us how technology engendered confidence in the ability to reach, to understand, and to ultimately dominate new regions of Africa and beyond. It's a vision of Africa vividly expressed in the Daily Mail commercial map of Africa, which Donna began with its outlines not only of current borders, but of future railway lines, tracing the potential for extending imperial control across the continent. When Henry Morton Stanley was preparing his widely publicized 1874 expedition, he recorded that beforehand he had received more than 1,200 letters from quack inventors, spiritualists, and magnetizers who promised, he wrote, to take me up in balloons or by flying carriages, make us all invisible by their magic arts or by the science of magnetism, cause all savages to fall asleep while we might pass anywhere without trouble. By the time of Stanley's expedition, as this would suggest, the idea of Africa as a space in which technology might become somehow magical had many recent precedents. The famous missionary David Livingstone had reported that his magic lantern slide projector had caused a panic in a Lunda audience in 1854, with the audience believing that a knife-wielding figure was about to emerge from the screen and attack them. His missionary narrative also included repeated incidents of Africans overawed by British inventions or manufactured goods, reporting them as exclaiming, "Ye are gods, not men." Livingstone's work was very influential on mid-Victorian ideas about Africa, and the legacies of his techno-magical narratives can be seen in the work of later imperial agents. In 1883, Joseph Thomson was appointed leader of a Royal Geographical Society expedition intended to map a route from the coast to the northern shores of Lake Victoria. His popular account of the expedition revealed that he had won his way through potentially hostile Maasai territory by posing as a white medicine man. Thomson wrote that he had concocted charms from effervescent tablets and used sleight of hand with his dentures to convince a group of young warriors that he had the power to make his teeth disappear. Thomson's travels helped to inspire H. Rider Haggard's famous imperial adventure novel, King Solomon's Mines, published in 1885. Haggard mimicked real exploration accounts in his novel with details of the expedition preparations and with a map which famously presented the lost African kingdom of Kukuanaland as resembling a woman's body, with the mountains of Sheba's breast and a triangle of mountains framing the mines into which the explorers must descend to find the treasure. This fictional map lent an air of authority and experience to the story, exploiting the blank spaces of Africa to imagine it as a body to be discovered and conquered. Like Thompson, Haggard's adventurers win access through posing as powerful beings from the stars, using the monocle and the dentures of one of their party to prove their magical bona fides. In a newspaper review, one letter writer accused Haggard of having lifted these techno-magical tropes from Thompson without attribution. Haggard responded hotly, insisting that these were common stories for anyone who had experience in Africa. In turn, these tropes from his extremely successful adventure novel became formative in later adventure fictions of lost kingdoms. So why did techno-magical stories like this become so popular? First, I think they were an assertion of simple superiority. They helped to place colonized peoples firmly in a lower rank of material and spiritual development, and to congratulate oneself on one's superiority and modernity. When we hear David Livingstone's anecdote of the Magic Lantern slide audience and their panic, we might think of the story of the early cinema audiences, supposedly in France, panicking at the sight of a train pulling into the station, believing that it was about to emerge and hit them. This story is probably apocryphal, but it's too good not to repeat because it makes us feel superior and modern. Secondly, as in Haggard's novel, this superiority was often expressed humorously. Techno-magical jokes about superstitious natives misunderstanding commonplace items became a mainstay of imperial humor, and a deus ex machina for fictional heroes outnumbered by hostile but credulous enemies in colonial spaces. And finally, and more speculatively, I think we can see them as a projection outwards into the colonial world of narratives of credulity and superstition around technology, which had originated within the metropole itself, perhaps a means of imaginatively processing the turmoil and dislocation of the Industrial Revolution. At the time, techno-magical episodes could also be controversial for contemporaries. They were a potentially disreputable or unsavory tactic. They were certainly disliked by David Livingstone and many of the missionaries who followed him. They were seen as counterproductive when it came to conversions and to winning over African peoples. Livingstone said that the almost magical effects of modern inventions could provoke wonder from his audiences, but he wrote, "The heart is unaffected." He disapproved, for example, of the Scottish big game hunter Ruelaine Gordon Cummings, who was an arms dealer who indulged in superstitions around sulfur as a good shooting medicine. Livingstone despaired when he heard of this. He considered it would be that much harder to win over converts if Europeans were seen as endorsing local superstitions. Others, like the Portuguese traveler Serpa Pinto, claimed that the effectiveness of these techno-magical strategies was often exaggerated, and that there were often pragmatic reasons for African peoples, and particularly leaders, claiming that Europeans were bringing magic. This could include the desire to build an alliance, to slow or to halt an expedition's progress, or to extract taxation and tributes. Mistranslations and misconceptions abounded in these encounters. Often in these contexts, a magician wasn't the all-powerful reshaper of reality of the European imagination, but a social category, legible and controllable. So the stranger, hailed as a rainmaker in one moment, was liable to find themselves taxed for causing a drought the next. Equally, grand claims of magical powers by imperial agents were liable to be dismissed if they didn't fit within pre-existing frameworks of belief. We can see in this map the bird's eye view of the Sudan, General Charles Gordon, whose expedition to Khartoum in 1884 to 5 was a popular obsession in Britain, reflected in the status of this souvenir map. Gordon, besieged for months in the city, wrote to the Mahdist forces at one point with a very strange threat. He wrote, "We are now preparing an earthquake by means of electricity, and I fear for you on its reaching your place." The reply from the besieging Mahdist generals was pretty withering, however. "No, O Excellency Gordon," they wrote, "that thy saying is nonsense, unworthy for an intelligent being to utter." So contrary to the popular image that these techno-magical deceptions were always successful, in reality, they were always contingent and contested. Finally, techno-magical pretenses like this were always liable to criticism as an act of unchristian hubris, setting oneself up as a god. There was a long tradition here dating back to the criticism of Captain James Cook for allegedly accepting the supposed worship offered to him in Hawaii. There was the popular idea that his death had been punishment for this hubris. Henry Morton Stanley was similarly criticized on some of his expeditions for using a concealed electric battery to administer shocks to unsuspecting Africans who he met to generate a kind of awe and fear around his presence. Wasn't this a cruel and hubristic act, playing God? But the tactic was also defended in a letter by one electrical engineer as what he called a harmless and efficient method of teaching a truth. Stanley had received a shock too, this engineer argued, but generations of civilization enabled him to understand it, whereas his victims had nothing to contextualize it but the supernaturalism of the so-called savage mind. So I think this suggests the self-aggrandizing and reassuring imaginative work being done by these techno-magical stories. This sense of quasi-divine superiority, even deployed ironically or humorously, helped to foster the authoritarianism and the violence of colonial regimes. When Stanley opened the Manchester Geographical Society in 1884 with praise for the entrepreneurial spirit which had seized on the chance to develop Central Africa, it was his employer, King Leopold II of Belgium, who he had in mind. Leopold's Congo Free State, which would be established the following year after much preparatory work by Stanley, would become infamous for the cruelty and violence of its regime. It helped to inspire Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, in which the rogue ivory trader Kurtz sets himself up as a divinity in his remote trading post. In what we are told was a brilliant essay on colonial administration, we are told that Kurtz wrote that colonial administrators must naturally appear to their subjects in the nature of supernatural beings. The power fantasy that lay behind this posture is revealed in his postscript, "Exterminate the brutes." So these maps offer a jumping off point for many of the questions that my project is exploring. They're a fascinating and rich resource reflecting contemporary attitudes and allowing us to read and reread them as sources in order to excavate the ideologies behind them. So I'd like to thank Donna and the John Rylands for this opportunity, and I think we can open it up to questions. Thank you.
Thank you both for that fascinating presentation. Yeah, if anybody has any questions, could you put them in the Q&A? I have a couple of things that I'd like to start with, actually, if we have time. I was really struck, actually, with what you said, Donna, about the Manchester Geographical Society welcomed women on an equal footing. And I wondered if there was any information about women being involved on the kind of commercial expeditions themselves. It seems to me that these are kind of narratives of great heroic masculine achievement. And I just wondered if there was any evidence for women being involved.
Yeah, there is evidence because there were lectures presented by women during the Society's lecture series. They did have several women who came to talk about their travels and expeditions, some in New Zealand. It's interesting because although when you kind of look at the history of the Society, they say that women were admitted on an equal footing. But I think you have to kind of be a little bit critical of that as well. There were no women that held senior positions. And also there's a commemorative portrait, which I can show you if you like, celebrating their 25th anniversary. And it's very kind of obvious in that there's no women in there. But it was a society which was of its time, and it was the first society of its kind to admit women. So I think it kind of deserves a little bit more delving into, and some kind of, critical eye.
Yeah, I thought that might be the case. Thank you for that. We've got a couple of questions that I'd just like to go to now. The first one is, did the society create or draw the maps? If not, who made them? Which printing company did print the maps, and were any advanced technologies used in drawing and printing? So I don't know if you know anything about the actual kind of processes of producing these.
I don't know that a lot of maps were actually created by the society. However, there was a volunteer kind of branch of the society called the Victorians, and we do know that they prepared maps for use in lectures. So the Victorians also kind of went out and lectured to members of the public, and they actually they did hundreds of lectures and reached thousands of people. So we do know that they prepared maps for these lectures. In the collection itself, I've only come across a handful of manuscript maps, which were probably created in the field during exploratory research. And then what was the second part of the question, Guide? Oh, what technique?
Is it, which printing company were any advanced technologies used in drawing and printing? I mean, I guess it's just reproduction technologies.
Yeah, I mean, the Manchester firms and the Liverpool firms, there's quite a lot of examples of their kind of printed ephemera in the collection, quite often donated as well to the society, or some copies would have been donated to the society.
I mean, maybe just following up with that with Brian then, I mean, are there accounts or maps or documents that are made by the individuals that you're studying, that you're using as primary sources?
Yeah, absolutely. The Joseph Thompson collections, this is the imperial agent who wrote Through Maasai Land. His collections are in the Royal Geographical Society, and a lot of them consist of these the sort of rough notebooks of surveying that he did while he was on his expedition every day, kind of long and, to the layman's eye, quite impenetrable lists of kind of numbers and coordinates and temperatures. So yeah, you can certainly see in these kinds of archives the raw materials from which these maps were made, along with sketches, often kind of brief landscape sketches, just to kind of show the topographical features that they were moving through.
Thank you. We've got a question here from M. Dodge, who I suspect is Martin Dodge. Are any of the maps annotated and marked to show that they were used at the time to understand the exploration and colonization? So yeah, we certainly have some maps which have been hand annotated, and I kind of mentioned just briefly in there that the Manchester Geographical Society have actually funded a cataloguing project for the maps, so that kind of information would be included in the catalogue record there as well. But yeah, there are certainly some hand annotated maps. So the questions are coming in thick and fast now, which is excellent. The next one, I think, is it's about archaeology rather than the kind of techno-magic, but I think it's a really interesting question. So was the archaeological exploration featured in the maps in any way? So the map of Sudan on the screen seems to use some of the motifs that seem to have originated from the exploration of ancient monuments and their essentialization. So do you have any thoughts on that?
The only thing I can kind of bring to mind at the moment is that we have some really detailed kind of plans of the Nile, and just trying to remember. I remember seeing little sketches and diagrams of archaeological sites which had little kind of benchmarks cut into them, which was quite interesting. But no, I think I'll have to have a longer think on that one.
I think there are questions here about the kind of like the archaeological impulse and the kind of commercial interests as well, and how these are sort of perceived by the kind of local populations. I've got some great questions about the techno-magical implications. So first of all, Anne says, were these techno-magical methods referred to as witchcraft? What is the difference between a medieval female witch and these male explorers?
Thanks, Anne. Yeah, it's an interesting question. Not generally referred to as witchcraft, even in the kind of playful references, it's generally kind of magic or sorcery, perhaps kind of refuting those kinds of associations, gendered associations that you kind of bring up there. One interesting thing which these kinds of encounters often bring up for commentators and for people involved is how they reflect upon the continued existence of supernatural beliefs and superstitions within Britain itself, often coming across kind of African magic and African medicine prompts people to think about the kind of the persistence of these things within particularly rural Britain. I think James Hannington, who was doing missionary work, reflected on his old kind of rural parish back in Devon, where faith healing and kind of miraculous religious medals were still in vogue. So they become this space for kind of thinking about modernity and thinking about the sort of dividing lines between superstition and belief and the kind of I don't know, the unfinished work of modernity and secularization within supposedly modern Britain.
Thank you. I'm just going to follow up with a question here from Max Jones, which is a question for Brian. It says, how far have you found assertions of European technological mastery failing? I'm thinking of polar explorers foundering in the Arctic by privileging new equipment over indigenous knowledge and practices.
Yeah, it's a recurring trope within techno-magical narratives of the kind of the false god unmasked. It dates back at least to Captain James Cook, where there's a powerful missionary discourse that builds up around his death, which I mentioned in the paper, that he had it coming, that this was a divine punishment for allowing himself to be set up as a god. American missionaries in Hawaii in the kind of century afterwards are really kind of popularized this narrative of Cook and his deserved punishment. And you can see this trope repeated, certainly in fictional accounts, but also as a kind of a recurring subtextual episode in narratives of exploration and missionary activity. There are often attempts to overawe which fall flat. In fiction, we can think about things like Kipling's The Man Who Would Be King, where the kind of quasi-divine British soldiers who set themselves up are revealed at the end. In Jules Verne's 5 Weeks in a Balloon, there's an episode in which the British who are traveling across Africa in a balloon have their balloon mistaken for the moon and themselves for the children of the moon. However, when the real moon rises, their worship is suddenly cut short and they have to flee from an angry crowd. So techno-magical narratives often fail in reality and very often fail in fiction and provide a kind of a satisfying comeuppance, a satisfying narrative arc to them.
We've got a question here from Georgina Hall who says, I think something similar. She says, were maps during the imperialist period largely produced to highlight and brag almost about colonial exploits rather than showing the world itself? Would you agree? I think that the colonial narratives are being challenged, certainly in fiction, as you mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a kind of a growing public appetite, which is kind of abetted by developments in the printing technology, which Donna was talking about, which allow these maps to become increasingly kind of detailed and colorful, and they become a kind of a real driver in print sales. The kind of proliferation in illustrated magazines and in magazines advertising their colored prints. These are definitely a big venue in which these imperial images and imperial ideologies are propagated.
Thank you. We've got some questions here around colonial subjects as well. So Georgina again said, would maps be used as a form of technology in order to mystify colonial subjects? You know, would these maps be shared with local populations? And Anne has said, you know, what's the situation about local maps, people in Africa making their own maps, what would be depicted and how does this differ from what we're seeing here? So two big questions there. Either of you?
I think in terms of, I think then you can kind of start getting into the question of what is a map as well. So people in Africa may have had route finding aids or methods of checking things like kind of tides or patterns, their environment that they lived in, rather than trying to recreate a three-dimensional sphere onto a flat piece of paper, if that makes sense. Plus, they wouldn't have the materials to do that. So I think map making, it is a very kind of Western kind of process, the way that the maps that we're talking of today anyway. What was important to be shown on a map from their point of view? Again, I think we have to start unpicking the whole idea of what a map is and what it symbolizes and what it represents. Maps are more, I think, than just scientific a means of kind of navigating from A to Z. There's the power of maps that's kind of embodied in them, the politics, the sociology. They're very kind of complex objects. They're not just navigational aids. So I think when we're talking about kind of indigenous people making their maps, I think they would be more kind of practical.
Thank you. Just following up with this, M. Dodge has put a question in asking, is the map library going to try and collect maps of African countries in print and in digital that are produced now that are part of ongoing neo-colonial projects in the continent? So I suppose future acquisitions, are we reframing what we're doing in the light of current research and current emphasis?
Yeah, I mean, I think it has to, you know, we still actively collect materials. So yes, would be the short answer to that. But then, you know, there's a different kind of way of mapping now. Mapping has become a lot more democratic. There's a lot more crowdsourced mapping, and quite often that's in a digital form. So how do you collect that? That's an issue that has to be addressed.
Well, Max has a question about that, actually. So Max Jones has said, will you comment on the physical challenges regarding research on maps? And I suppose this is kind of using maps, working on maps more generally. Maps can be difficult to show on desktop screens, and he thinks that maps are understudied because of this. But you know, this is the kind of medium in which we largely work these days.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's kind of one of the reasons for this kit as well, if you like, because what we're showing today is oversized material. So we've got a ceiling mounted kind of camera, but nothing kind of substitutes being able to see these kind of artifacts in the flesh, if you like. You know, maps are big and there's a lot of detail on them. And if you try and shrink that and put it on a screen, you never really get a sense of, I think, the craftsmanship involved, as well as not just being able to see the detail on the map. You kind of lose the impressiveness of these things, I think. You know, we have a map room, but lots of universities no longer have a map room. So yeah, where would you look at these things? A lot of collections have disappeared over the last 20 years. There's a kind of misconception that everything's online, which, you know, there's only a tiny, tiny tip of the surface of such collections online. But certainly it is difficult. They're large. They've been described as space-hungry beasts. You know, you need a large place to store them and you need a large place to study them. We're lucky in Manchester, you know, we've got this resource. Plenty of places haven't.
Thank you. I've got one more question that I think we can take and then we can wrap it up. It's a question from Ali. I think this is something which you mentioned at the beginning of the talk, but they're asking, were there friendly relations and cooperation or tensions between the RGS in Manchester and in London? So I guess the MGS and the RGS. And was there a crossover between the members of the Manchester Chamber of Commerce and the Geographical Society?
I can certainly say that the relationship between RGS and MGS was friendly and cooperative. In fact, they worked together really well on promoting or improving geography education in schools and universities. So yeah, actually they did work well together. Quite often MGS would have used some of the Royal Geographical Society maps and source material in their lectures too.
Thank you. Brian, is there anything you'd like to add about that? Has anything come out from your research around kind of tensions? And I'm just looking for tensions. I'm sure it was all very cold.
Just looking for the drama. Yeah. I'm afraid I couldn't comment on that.
I mean, it seems to me that there is this sort of sense that, you know, Manchester is the kind of practical commercial one, you know, in that sort of general view of Manchester from the south.
Certainly comes out strongly in the Stanley opening address, where he paints a very sleepy picture of the London Royal Geographical Society, fair or not, as kind of having shelves and shelves of dusty maps that they weren't properly exploiting.
Yeah, but you said that, you know, the audience were whipped to fever pitch, and I just wondered if there was like a kind of spontaneous riot in reaction to what he was saying, but perhaps not. Okay, so I'd like to close by thanking our speakers again for this fascinating paper, and also to all of our audience members who put the questions in. I'm afraid I wasn't able to take all of the questions, but I think if you did want to follow up individually, we'd be happy to do it via email, and then eventually in the comments on the YouTube channel when the video is posted. Next week's seminar will be from the John Rylands Library itself on Deansgate at the same time at 12 p.m. and on the same link. It's going to feature Gerard Rosera, Stephen Pearce and Jane Gallagher, who'll be talking to us about the Bible in West Africa, exploring early missionary translations in Ghana and Nigeria. So you can find more information about that on the What's On page, and you'll find the Eventbrite link to register. I'm hoping that we can put that in the chat here as well, perhaps. So thank you all for joining us, and I hope I'll see many of you again next week.